Is the US economy really in such bad shape that it deserves a downgrade? Or is there more going on behind the scenes with Moody's? While many experts and policymakers are pointing fingers and raising eyebrows, Moody's recent decision to shift its outlook has set off a firestorm of debate. On today's episode of Dividend Dreamer, we're diving into what this downgrade truly means, why the timing is suspicious, and whether this is a sign of economic weakness or something entirely political. Buckle up because this conversation goes deeper than most headlines dare to go. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. Was the Moody's downgrade deserved? Some say yes, others argue it's a political move. But one thing is certain, the timing is odd. The downgrade came before a critical bill even passed through Congress. That's left many questioning the real motive behind the call. Moody's rationale appears to rest on a few key assumptions. They cite rising entitlement spending and flat government revenue as reasons to expect larger deficits over the next decade. But here's the problem. Those projections are built on assumptions that may not reflect economic reality. Take the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, for example. Their estimates assume U.S. GDP growth will stay under 2% annually. That's pessimistic, especially when compared to past growth during previous administrations. And Moody's, while not revealing its own exact models, seems to be following a similar doom and gloom trajectory. But here's where things get more complicated. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is high, about 100%. But that's not unusual globally, especially following an era of near-zero interest rates. Countries across the industrialized world, from Japan to much of Europe, have been navigating similar fiscal waters. So why single out the United States now? Especially when we're talking about the world's reserve currency, backed by the most productive workforce per capita and one of the fastest growing economies among developed nations. It raises eyebrows that this downgrade was announced on a Friday, before seeing what the final budget bill would even look like. And there's another major issue, expired tax policies. Moody's seems to believe that letting long-standing tax breaks expire will somehow add to the deficit, but many economists argue that's just poor forecasting. These tax codes have been in place for over 7 years. Assuming their expiration will automatically hurt the economy doesn't tell the full story. Now, if we circle back to Moody's statement, they argue that long-term deficits are being driven by entitlements and stagnant revenue. That's partially true, but it's not the whole picture. Medicare and Medicaid spending is set to increase, yes, but much of that impact isn't felt until far beyond the next decade. Meanwhile, revenue as a share of GDP has been above historical norms. So what's really driving the deficit lately? Excessive government spending. But here's the twist. The exact shape and scale of that spending hasn't even been finalized yet. Congress is still negotiating the budget, and that uncertainty makes Moody's move even more questionable. In terms of interest rates, it's worth noting that 10-year Treasury yields have recently jumped from below 4% to around 4.5%. This isn't necessarily a red flag. Rather, it reflects that recession fears have cooled off and investors view the U.S. economy as fundamentally sound. The term premium, or the added yield investors demand for holding long-term debt, is still lower than earlier this year. Then there's the issue of tariffs. The current administration is pursuing a new round of tariffs, aiming for a baseline of around 10%. That's the highest level in decades, and it's likely to generate significant revenue, possibly over $200 billion annually. Yet that figure hasn't been factored into forecasts like the CBO's, simply because those tariffs haven't been legislated into law yet. Even if the final revenue is only half that, say $100 billion a year, that's still $1 trillion over the next decade. A number like that should not be ignored when discussing long-term fiscal health. For fiscal conservatives, the Moody's report is something of a gift. It gives them ammunition to call for slower government spending. And to be clear, the pace of spending absolutely needs to be reined in. But let's not confuse slowing spending with slashing budgets. These cuts are often reductions in future growth, not actual rollbacks in spending. Another major problem with Moody's forecast? Their assumptions about economic growth. If we're basing long-term projections on a 1.8% growth rate, we're setting ourselves up for failure. That's significantly lower than what we've seen in recent years, even under administrations with widely differing fiscal strategies. Let's say growth stabilizes at 3%. That alone adds an estimated $4 trillion more in revenue than what the CBO predicts. That's a game changer. And again, this is without raising the share of GDP that comes from taxes. Moody's also brings up concerns about the interest burden on U.S. debt. Fair point. But interest rates are expected to come down as the Federal Reserve reacts to softening inflation data. In fact, by Jay Powell's own supercore inflation measure, excluding energy and housing, the economy looks ripe for rate cuts. And if rates normalize and the curve flattens, those future interest costs will shrink. That's another area where Moody's may be overestimating the problem. So what does this all mean for investors and taxpayers? The Moody's downgrade might feel like a warning shot, but when you dig into the details, it's built on flawed assumptions and questionable timing. It assumes slow growth, ignores potential revenue from tariffs, and overlooks the health of key economic indicators. At Dividend Dreamer, we believe that a deeper understanding of these issues is crucial. Not everything is as it seems on the surface. And if the assumptions are wrong, the conclusions probably are too. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future insights right here on Dividend Dreamer. We bring you truth beyond the headlines, straight to the point.